Growing up on a Native American reservation, author Deborah Jackson Taffa was a perceptive observer of what is lost when Indigenous families feel pressure to assimilate. Taffa's loving and ambitious parents wanted their children to have futures beyond the reservation and wanted them to have the educations they were denied. Luckily for readers, Jackson as a child was a writer in the making and able to recognize the value of her ancestral past.
I wanted to let people get really close to the childhood experience of what it felt like to grow up kind of simultaneously going around with a Walkman listening to the Violent Femmes and kind of yearning for this tribal history that had a lot of traditions and kind of not knowing which world I belonged in.
In her lyrical and illuminating memoir, Whiskey Tender, Taffa takes readers along as she sorts out what it means to live in two worlds at once. Taffa's memoir is a fresh take on coming of age as both Native and American, both a family history and a reclamation of an ancestral heritage. Deborah Jackson Taffa, it's great to have you here today to talk about your book, Whiskey Tender.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Your book's a memoir, and it chronicles your family's time in first Yuma, Arizona, and then I believe you were in the Navajo Nation, Farmington, in New Mexico. Tell us a little bit about that time and the moves that your family made.
Right. Yeah, I think it's kind of counterintuitive for people to think of a Native American story as an immigration or a migration story, but that's absolutely what it is. You know, I was born on the Yuma Indian Reservation, which is in southeastern California, but correctly so. It's across the river from Yuma, Arizona, so on the banks of the Colorado. And my father was trained to be a welder with a program called the American Indian Relocation Program, or Public Law 959, that was designed in the termination era to assimilate Native American people to mainstream society. So when I was 6 years old, we were drawn off of the reservation and plunked into a little town in the Four Corners region that had been developed by a lot of people from Texas to be kind of an oil boom fracking kind of coal town, and he worked at a power plant on the Navajo reservation.
Yes. Yes.
Quite a bit of culture shock with that move.
Yeah. And it primarily centers on you and your three sisters, your three
Yes.
older sisters. You have a couple of other siblings who came along later.
Yeah.
But your parents had a real ambition for all of you girls. They really wanted you to be educated. And
Yeah, I think my father had been kind of scared straight because he had gotten into trouble with the law as a teenager. And I think he was always pretty talented in school, and so was my mother, but they had just both disidentified with the goal of finishing high school. So they only had their GEDs. And when we came on the scene, they were those type of parents that really wanted their kids to achieve everything that they had not. So when we got to New Mexico, my father was essentially of the belief that the public schools were poor. They sent us to Catholic schools, and there was a lot of pressure put on us to be model minorities, to excel not only in sports, but in musical, like we played the violin and the piano, and we had to do really well, get straight A's. It was hard. It was a lot of pressure. But I think ultimately the takeaway is that, as a minority, my father really believed in the American dream. And he believed in America as a meritocracy. And I think he just really thought that we could pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we would be able to enter the mainstream and be successful. And there are a lot of sacrifices inherent in that as a Native kid.
Mm-hmm. Are your parents still living?
My mother passed away at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was really interesting because, it was hard to lose her. But she had been sick for some time. And I think before, when she was still alive, the book really centered on my father. And after she died, she really emerged in the book in a way that made her more of a central character than I anticipated she would be. A lot of her history came to the kind of to the front for me because I was missing her a lot. And so the final edit of the book involved my mother more than I thought it might.
And your mother was Latina.
She was.
And your father is Native American.
Yes. So my mother was born in Socorro, New Mexico, And in northern New Mexico, she would refer to, most people there refer to themselves as Hispanic.
Yeah.
So they identify very much with their Spanish ancestors, but most Spanish or Latino people in the Southwest also have indigenous bloodlines. But my mother didn't like to talk about that. She didn't want to see herself as indigenous at all. And so I had problems with her because I was very proud of my father's Native American family and my Native American lineage. And I didn't want to, I don't know, I kind of felt like there was some push and pull within the family itself, where my mother wanted us to identify as sort of white via her Spanish bloodlines, when I clearly felt very indigenous growing up in the Southwest. So it was a very confusing coming of age.
Yeah. And to make it more confusing, you had moved from where your father's tribe was to the Navajo Nation, which isn't your tribe, and there was even some moments where you felt out of place just because of that.
Yeah, you know, Dene people or Navajo people, they have a huge, enormous reservation. And so it was not unusual to meet a young Dene guy that I might like or that I might be friends with. And not only could he not date me, he wasn't allowed to date other Navajo girl from certain clans. Like, they're very, very traditional in the way that they live their lives, or they were when in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. And so I was a minority Native kid in a Navajo majority. And then I didn't fit in quite either with the other Hispanic or Latino kids or the white kids. So I feel like I was this very liminal child that kind of never knew where to put my feet to feel entirely at home. And the education system didn't help because they didn't teach us anything about our history back in the 70s and the 80s. You know, it was all very much about Plymouth Rock and sort of the English marching across the United States, manifest destiny. We never studied about the Spanish conquistadors coming up from Mexico, so I was very unsure about my own history.
Well, as I read your book, I felt I was watching a writer in the making, first of all. Do you feel that as you look back?
I think I was, and it's portrayed in the book, you know, you have to depict yourself, which is such an odd thing in memoir, as you're creating a representation and a persona of yourself. And one of the ways I portray myself, which is absolutely true, is I was always the little kid at the edge of the room eavesdropping on the adults, right?
Yeah.
And the other kids might be outside playing, but I was kind of the one who was always curious about what is happening here. And my older sisters would tease me and say that, you know, I was an ancestor when I was very young because I was maybe a little more serious and worried and watchful. And I think that's a trait that a lot of authors share, right? When we look back, we're sort of the people that are in the doorway watching a lot and maybe never really feeling like a part of the scene, but somebody who's observing and witnessing. And I witnessed my family go through a lot of pain and many tragedies, and I hope that I was able to bring some humor, some dark humor, some sort of gallows humor to the book. I want it to be fun and engaging, but at the same time I wanted to show the effects of governmental policies on the family. One of the things that you're confronted with when you write a memoir is how much can I reveal about the personal tragedies and difficulties that my family has experienced. And for me, that took a very long time to kind of bargain and barter with. I kept thinking, what can I include? Why should I reveal these very personal stories about my family when they're painful? And the answer in the end was, if I can in some ways educate people about the governmental policies that affected my family and expose hidden histories that most Americans don't know about, from Indian boarding schools to the Relocation Act to the, you know, there's the largest open pit uranium mine in the country on my grandma's reservation in New Mexico, and it made her very sick, then it would be worthwhile. And so I think that was the trade-off for me, is like I could expose my family if it was in service to sort of a larger truth about who we are as citizens in the United States, Native American people, our contributions and the things that have harmed us.
Yes. I see what you mean, because like in the case of your grandmother, it would just be a tragic incident that she got ill, but then when we understand why, it takes on a bigger meaning.
Yeah, especially in the context of World War II, which was that, Native American people gave a lot. They signed up for the war to fight in the war without being drafted. They were very eager to protect the United States. And those are really wonderful things that the public should know about. One of the things that hurt me so much growing up was that when I took American history classes, Native American history always began at that juncture of colonization, when things got very dark for our people. And nowhere in the history books did I get to learn about the grand sort of botanical, architectural achievements of my people, the mathematical achievements, of which there were many in North and South America. So as a child, it makes you feel always a little bit of cultural cringe about your culture. And then as you get older and you become more educated, you think, oh, if Native kids knew more about this, they could carry themselves around in the world with more pride. And that's essentially who I wrote the book for, I think, is for, I'm happy for the country to listen in, but it was written for Indigenous youth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it might be the blurb from Tommy Orange, who says it's different. It's unique in some of the Native American books. And I felt like I really saw not only, just the sort of like multidimensional view of your father, who is a very appealing dad. He's a great dad.
He is a great dad.
You know,
really
despite having to overcome a lot of things. And so your book doesn't in any way just sort of center on the stereotypes.
Yeah, but you're right that in Native American literature, a lot of times we have the commodity cheese, we have sort of the poverty, and in some ways there's this stereotype of Native American people being unable to pull themselves up and better their own circumstances. And that has never been my experience of Native people. I know so many professional Native women who are working as lawyers and professors and business owners. My father had 3 jobs. He worked himself to the bone to try to get us ahead in life. And you don't see those portrayals. And so a lot of what I'm doing in the book, I feel like, is reclaiming the pejorative, making sure that people see sort of a broader idea of who we are. And, a lot of times a memoir is written about a sliver of life that has to do with a difficulty, a divorce or an illness or a battle with alcoholism or something like that. I wanted to do something that was a true coming-of-age story, a Bildungsroman that showed what it meant for me to become a full-fledged American citizen while also being Native American in this period of the 70s and 80s. And one of the books that inspired me so much in my youth and made me think I would love to do that is Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which has sort of a breadth of growing up in the pages. And so that's really was my goal for many years, and it took a long time to achieve.
How long did it take you to write this?
Oh, it took a decade, yeah.
Did it?
And I sold it as a memoir because I knew that people would be attached to the story of this child. And there was very little history and politics in the book at that point. And then it was purchased by an editor at HarperCollins, and when she got it, she told me, this book is essentially done. What do you want to do with it in the year that we have it? And I told her I would love to infuse it with a little more sort of hidden policies and hidden histories and without breaking the narrative arc of the child. I didn't want to digress so far that what you ended up with was like a nonfiction brick that nobody reads because it's dry, Again, my goal was to be engaging. I wanted to write something that made people laugh and made people cry and had some emotion in it. And she told me, don't worry, I've got you. We'll go ahead. And so we would move ahead and I would write sections and she would trim it back when she thought it was becoming too digressive. And together, I think we achieved the perfect balance. She was a wonderful editor.
Of those nonfiction sort of
elements. Right, exactly.
Yeah. It just was such a different look at life.
Yeah. This gang of sisters that I have as we move out into the world, one of the things I hope is that other people who have immigrated to the United States see the same sort of mistakes and goofy foibles and, the things that we encounter because we don't have parents who can say, this is what it means to go to prom, or this is what it means to do all of this all-American stuff. We're kind of encountering it. We're the first people in our family to go to college. We're the first people in our family to do a lot of different things that most Americans kind of take as general, everybody goes through this.
Right.
And so those were the moments when I felt I could find some humor and some levity for the reader. I hope it's not a read that feels too, difficult for people. I wanted it to flow and be a fun read.
Yeah, I think it is. I really like the book a lot. Where did the title come from?
Everybody keeps asking me that. It's so funny. I think when people see the word whiskey in conjunction with Native American people, it conjures a lot of painful stereotypes. Yeah. And then you see the word tender, and it kind of turns it on its head, And the thing is, when you write a memoir, you're not seeking to crown anybody with a black hat or give anybody like a halo. People are rounded. We're good and we're bad, and we're a mix of things. And my family has had difficulties, but it also has had really beautiful experiences filled with love and support, mutual support. And so I just think it's a confrontational title, And then last year in Santa Fe, I interviewed Colin McCann, and he told me, the word whiskey, the origin of the word, the etymology of the word in Irish? And I said, no. And he said, it means water of life. And, in the book, I write about how, for example, in the Native American church, and we use plants as some sort of aid to help us survive, power plants. And I think whiskey for Irish people has that same sort of magic, that it's not entirely negative. I never personally had problems with alcoholism, and I just feel like it's hard to speak to. I think maybe part of it also is just that it's a catchy title that people don't forget.
That's true.
People hear Whiskey Tender and they're like, oh, that's catchy. I'll remember that.
And there's no subtitle with it. It's just Whiskey Tender.
Whiskey Tender. And a lot of times they try to make you have a subtitle in nonfiction, so I was lucky that they didn't make me do it.
Is it hard to write memoir?
It's very difficult to write memoir.
What's difficult about it?
I think all of us kind of lie to ourselves. We have cognitive dissonance. We have blind spots. We want to be likable. We want to see ourselves as good. And so a lot of times there's a defense mechanism that goes on when you write a memoir, where you write a couple of pages and you put it aside and you come back a few days later and you look at it and you realize that you were lying to yourself.
Yeah.
And that it wasn't the complete truth, or that there's a self-protective stance going on. So I think, when you first start writing memoir or personal essay, your workshop is incredibly valuable to you. If you have a workshop with 20 people, maybe half of the feedback you get you can throw away, and a quarter of it, they really understand what you're going for. And a quarter is challenging, and it might seem kind of mean, the comments that they make, like, I don't believe you. That's a very valuable bunch of feedback that you get when it's pushing back, because it requires looking deeper, and then looking deeper again, and then looking deeper again. And there's a great gift in memoir, too, though. If you live a very difficult, tragic moment that takes 5 minutes to transpire, and then you spend a month writing that scene and finding a beautiful image and finding lyric language and working it and massaging it. By the time you're done, the memory of having written it surpasses the memory of having lived it. And you have this beautiful object, this published essay or a section of a book that it's been like you've taken this ugly little moment and spun it into gold. And so, I would never say that you create art in a way that you're kind of seeking to have a cathartic effect, but I think that that's the outcome of writing memoir. If you had told me that I was going to share some of the events of this book with people publicly on a national stage when I was in my 20s, I would have been very mortified at the idea. And instead, I feel really good and very calm about the fact that I've done it. So I think that's a tribute to how much writing memoir can really heal and help your soul.
And that you probably found the right stories to tell within it.
Right, because you don't include everything. And that's, art is arrangement. A lot of what happens in a memoir is what gets cut is just as important as what gets included. And so, when you write it, there are ultimately things that don't fit. And you're flattening a three-dimensional identity in life into a two-dimensional representation. Certainly, who I am as an adult today, having lived in many cultures around the world and, marrying somebody who's an immigrant from Europe, like I have this very rich identity that didn't fit in this particular book. So it always feels like, well, I kind of have cut out things that feel essential to who I am today, but my focus in this book was who I was as a child.
Yeah.
And so I had to really stick with that.
I must say, the arc of this young girl growing up, realizing who she was, the marriage that her parents have, plus the ancestors that she has, what all those mean to her. There was something portrayed where it really was an arc of discovery.
One of the things that I really wanted to portray in the book is sort of the embodied conundrum of not being sure how to enter American society when you also simultaneously feel kind of betrayed by it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
No one takes their kids when they're 5 or 6 years old and says, there's this ugly history behind what has happened to your people. But I can understand them because I wouldn't want to tell my grandkids a lot of negative things at too young an age about America or about the United States or about our president.
Sure.
You kind of try to give them also a chance to be children. And so I hope that I embodied sort of the individual decisions that a Native American person has to make about how they fit into society. For my sisters, that was always going to be something where they were really happy with mainstream America.
Right.
But I was just that weird kid who always felt like, well, these rites of passage are a little sad, and I wish I had more tribal or traditional rites of passage that I could engage in. They were very happy with Catholicism, and I was more questioning of Christianity and how it fit in my life.
So you're teaching Native American writers now. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I am. I landed at the Institute of American Indian Arts, which is a low residency MFA program. You come in twice a year in January and July for a 10-day residency intensive with teachers like Tommy Orange and Pam Houston and Brandon Hobson. We have a lot of really wonderful teachers who also come in. And students there study in fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction, and screenwriting. So a couple of our graduates were screenwriters on the television show Reservation Dogs.
Oh, great.
And it's not all Native students. We have about 70% Native students, and then we have 30% non-Native students who, for some reason or another, find it very appealing, the idea of working with our institute and our professors. And I think it's because they're looking for sort of an alternative definition of what it means to be American. A lot of times, thematically, they're working in environmentalism, or I have a student, for example, who had polio as a child, was born in India, came to the United States, is disabled, and she's a painter, and she's writing about the disability of the earth and the disability of her body. We have people who have been kind of kicked out of maybe their Quaker religion as children, and they're looking for, or people who don't have kids and are trying to define what family means. If you don't have a traditional marriage and children, can we redefine what family means? They're all working from the margins, and they fit in really well with the community. It's a 2-year program, and they come out to Santa Fe, and it's a really wonderful thing. I'm happy with it.
Yeah. How does it feel to be teaching a younger generation of at least some Native American students?
There was this thing called the Native American Renaissance, literary Renaissance, that took place in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So N. Scott Momaday won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel, and then the publishing industry published a slew of older Native American people, older than me, who are now in their 70s, from Louise Erdrich to Leslie Marmon Silko, Simon Ortiz. It was a burgeoning time period, and then it faded away and disappeared. And we had Sherman Alexie, who published for a long time, but he was kind of the one Native that they would publish. It was like the publishing industry thought that they had their person. And then now we have this new upcoming, they're calling it a new literary renaissance. And the kids that are in this younger generation are they're very intersectional. So they might be half Scottish and half Navajo, or they might, you know what I mean? They have these really interesting identities. Some of them are coming out of the Ivies and some are coming out of tribal community colleges. It's a true mix, and it's really, really exciting. I am working in this kind of very quiet in-between with a few writers like Ramona Emerson, who wrote Shudder, Layli Long Soldier, she wrote Whereas. We're kind of that 1980s generation. We graduated all in 1980s, but there aren't as many books that are coming out of that era. So I keep telling everybody, I don't want to call this new boom in publishing the second Native American literary renaissance, because that suggests that it rises and then it fades and disappears. I hope that it's permanent, because I think as a culture we deserve to have narratives and counter-narratives in our literature. We should disagree with each other about the way we see our world. We don't want one coming-of-age memoir. We want multiple that are kind of interfacing with each other, right? We want to have narratives that address middle-class concerns. Like, is there anybody out there who's writing about living in this particular political season that we have going on? What is that like from a Native perspective? We deserve to have Native novels that are romance, or that have a joyful ending, or that don't partake in trauma, historic trauma at all.
Yeah.
So we're so far away from achieving like a full-bodied literature culturally for our people. And so I hope that this wave, and if I can be a part of that, wonderful, because it lessens the burden of representation on me. It's a lot of heavy lifting to write a book and think your book has to change the world. You know, it takes forever. It's just really painful. So being the director of this program for me has been so satisfying and kind of has relaxed me, because what if I discover someone who's the equivalent of a Native American Toni Morrison in the world of fiction? What if I help them get through their MFA and start publishing?
Yeah.
How incredible. I get to be a small part of that story and this story and that story. That's really what I'm seeking with my work.
Great. Yeah, what's next for you in terms of writing?
Well, I won an NEA fellowship, right? A National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship in Prose.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
Wow.
and it was wonderful. In January or February, they made the announcement. And that was based on a 2-part memoir series that I had proposed. And so it picks up where this book, kind of drops off, and is sort of the part of the story where I move out into the world and end up in Africa and Indonesia and travel all over the place and become the adult that I am. I go back to live on the reservation for a time period. And that book, I'm maybe 30,000 words in. This one I did not sell on partial pages, because it's difficult with the first book, but also because I was worried that it might be shaped in a way I didn't want by an editor. The second book, I think I would be more willing to sell on partial pages.
And get the process going.
I think we'll probably see that book in the world maybe in the next 4 to 5 years. I'm hoping.
Great. Well, Deborah Jackson Taffa, it's great to have you here to talk about the book. Thanks for being with us.
I really appreciate being here. Thank
I
you
really
so
enjoyed
much
it.
for having me.